This is the wide belt sander. It's a surfacing machine that helps us to finish surfacing our faces because it sands and cleans up all those machine marks and torn grain. Your material needs to be at least 12 inches long. Your material also needs to be at least 1/4 of an inch thick. That's also the thinnest that you can sand on the wide belt sander is 1/4 of an inch. The feeding belt here is 43 inches wide. So that's the maximum width of material that we can send through. And the material can be any maximum length, but just a minimum length of 12 inches. Let me point a few things out on the wide belt sander. Here we've got our infeed table and similar outfeed table on the back. Over here, we've got our motor start and stop. We have our feeding belt start and stop. This raises and lowers our feeding belt, but it doesn't do it precisely. We've got our emergency stop, and then we have our control panel here that does our precise measurements and depths of cut. Here I've created some signs to remind us what our maximum depth of cut is, as well as a fraction to decimal conversion chart for inches and millimeters. Come take a closer look at our control panel. This is our control panel, and it's currently set to 1 inch. It also can run on millimeters. If you need to change the unit, then you just hit the unit button and that changes, and it shows you this light up here that reminds you which units you're using. So please just keep in mind which units you're hoping to use. To set the machine, you're going to type in your measurement and then hit the green button. So we're going to say set. And if I wanted something at 20 millimeters, I would type in 20 and then hit the green button. And the machine comes to that mark. If I was in inches and wanted to set it to 3/4 of an inch, I would hit set 0.75 green button. Our depth of cut sign reminds us that we should only be removing 2/100ths of an inch or 1/2 millimeter each pass. So once you have your setting and you want to subtract 2/100ths, you would hit the buttons set, 0.02, and then the subtract sign. If you're in millimeters and need to change your depth of cut for the next pass, then you will hit set, 0.5, and then the subtract button. Using this controller helps us to keep track of our depth of cut so that we're not taking off more than our max depth of cut. Okay, let's talk about some of the safety. Here we have our gauge plate, and if your material or a hand hits that while the machine is on, then the machine automatically turns off. So make sure to have your measurements done correctly and then feed it so that you know that that end is going to go under that gauge plate. We run our material with the direction of the grain, similar to the planer. So as our long grain runs this way, that's how we're going to enter it through. We don't want to send it through across the grain unless we have a panel that's wide enough to be over our 12-inch minimum. We want to keep our hands free and clear of the feeding belt area so that we don't get pinched. We also just want to make sure to do our measurements correctly so that the machine stays safe as well. This machine has sensors on the inside that keep the sanding belt into place. Those sensors can shut off if they get dusty. So please just remember to turn on the dust collecting system when you're using this machine. It's also good to remember that we should only be sanding dry and clean material through this machine. It shouldn't be green, wet, have paint, varnish, finish, anything like that. We would want to remove those things before we send it through the wide belt sander. Okay, so here's an example. I've got a piece of sapele here that's been milled and squared, and I just need to bring it to its final thickness and remove some of the torn grain from the other machines. So your first step is to measure the thickness of your board. You can do that using a tape measure. However, it may be more accurate to use a digital caliper. I keep one up here just for that reason. Make sure that the units on your caliper are set to the same units as the wide belt sander. So if I'm in inches, I can see that I'm at 0.68 inches. So that's what I'll set the machine to. So I'll hit set 0.68 and then hit the green button for my initial setup. Now I'm ready to turn on the dust collecting system and turn on our machine. It should be obvious once that torn grain is removed. However, you can also use a pencil to make a mark on each face. And once that pencil line has disappeared, that's a good indication that you're probably done or close to being done. So I'm going to turn my machine on. It takes a couple of seconds to come up to speed. Then I'll turn on my feeding wheel. Ready for my next pass, so I'm going to subtract 2/100 of an inch by pressing set 0.02 minus, which brings us to 0.66. I'm going to flip my board and send it through again. And turn my machine off and the feeding wheel off and let those spin down. You'd continue that same process, subtracting a depth of cut and sending your material through, and keep flipping those faces until you don't see any torn grain or any machine marks and it's nice and clean. If you are sanding to a specific thickness, then keep that in mind. You can, for the most part, trust the numbers on the control gauge, but if it's a critical dimension for a wood joint, you may also want to double check with a caliper as you go to make sure that you're not accidentally sanding a little bit too much. So that's the wide belt sander. Please keep in mind all the safety guidelines and be safe as you use this machine.